There's a question I've been wrestling with for months now. Not a simple question. Not the kind you ask and forget, the kind that follows you into sleep and waits for you when you wake. Who decides what we remember? I'm not talking about personal memory. I'm talking about collective memory, historical memory, the grand narrative we're all taught in school, the one that shapes how we understand civilization itself. Someone curated that narrative. Someone chose what stays and what disappears. And the deeper I looked into the gaps, the silences, the deliberate omissions, the stories that vanish without explanation, the more I realized we're not dealing with accidents. We're dealing with architecture. The architecture of forgetting. This investigation began with Tartaria, yes, but it didn't end there. It couldn't. Because once you start pulling at that particular thread, the entire tapestry begins to unravel. What I found wasn't just the erasure of one civilization or one empire. What I found was a pattern, a methodology, a system so vast and so coordinated that it suggests something most people refuse to consider. That our understanding of history isn't incomplete by accident, it's incomplete by design. There's an organization behind this, a network, a hidden architecture of power that operates through banking systems, through publishing houses, through educational institutions, through the very mechanisms we trust to tell us the truth. They don't wear uniforms, they don't announce themselves, but they're there, in the gaps, in the silences, in the perfectly coordinated erasure of knowledge across continents and centuries. And what they've hidden isn't just history. It's power itself, the power that comes from knowing what humanity once knew, the technologies we once possessed, the wisdom we once practiced, all of it systematically removed from our collective consciousness, leaving us weaker, more manageable, more dependent on the systems they control. This is their story, or rather the story of what they don't want you to know. Let me start with what made me suspicious in the first place. It wasn't the buildings. Everyone talks about the buildings, the impossible architecture, the advanced techniques, the symmetry and scale that seem beyond the capabilities of the supposed era. But that's not what caught my attention initially. It was the silence. The deafening, coordinated silence across every major historical institution simultaneously. Here's what I mean. Pick any major civilization from recorded history. Egypt, Rome, Greece, Persia, Mongolia. You can find thousands of primary sources. Documents, letters, administrative records, tax ledgers, personal diaries, court proceedings. The mundane machinery of civilization leaves traces everywhere. Mountains of traces. But with Tartaria, nothing. Not nothing in the sense of not much. Nothing in the sense of systematic absence. Maps show it. Encyclopedias mention it. Geographic references span centuries. And then suddenly around the mid-1800s it all stops. Not gradually. Not with a slow fade as empires do. But with surgical precision. The official explanation? It was just a geographic term. A vague reference to unclaimed territories. Nothing more. The official explanation collapses here, because geographic terms don't require systematic removal from maps, encyclopedias, and historical records across multiple nations, languages, and continents. Geographic terms don't necessitate the rewriting of history textbooks in France, England, Russia, America, and Germany within the same narrow time window. Geographic terms don't spark coordinated silence among institutions that otherwise competed with each other fiercely. This raises a simple but critical question. Who coordinated that silence? I started looking at banking networks, not modern banks, though they're part of this. I started looking at the financial architecture that emerged during the same period the historical record was being rewritten. The 1800s, the century of consolidation. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Major banking families began consolidating power across Europe in the late 1700s and early 1800s. They didn't just lend money, they controlled currencies, they financed wars on both sides. They built networks that transcended national boundaries, networks that made nations themselves seem almost quaint by comparison. And here's where it gets interesting. These networks didn't just finance governments, they financed education, they financed publishing, they financed universities. They became the invisible hand behind the institutions that decided what history meant, what truth was, what knowledge could be taught. This wasn't charity, this was control. When you control the mechanisms that produce knowledge, you control knowledge itself. When you control knowledge, you control how people understand their world, their potential, their limitations. You control what they believe is possible. The deeper I went, the more I found the same names appearing in the most unexpected places. Banking families financing archaeological expeditions. Banking families endowing university chairs in history and anthropology. Banking families establishing publishing houses that would go on to produce the definitive textbooks of their era, not suspicious in isolation, but taken together, with the timing, with the systematic erasure happening simultaneously. The evidence suggests something much larger. Let me give you a specific example. The Encyclopedia Britannica. In its early editions, 1771, 1797, 1810, Tartary appears extensively. It's described as a vast region, sometimes an empire, with detailed maps showing its extent across northern Asia. The entry is substantial, detailed, matter of fact. By the late 1800s, reduced, minimized, reframed as mere geography. By the mid-1900s, nearly absent. Now you might say, that's just scholarly refinement. Better information. Updated research. But here's the problem. Better information doesn't erase. It adds context. It complicates. It nuances. What happened to Tartary in encyclopedias isn't refinement, it's removal. And it happened across every major encyclopedia simultaneously. British, French, German, American, Russian. This raises the question, who had the influence to coordinate that? Individual editors make individual choices. But when dozens of editors across multiple countries and competing publishers all make the same choice in the same historical window, that's not coincidence, that's coordination, and that coordination requires infrastructure. I started digging into the publishing networks of the 1800s. Who owned what? Who financed whom? Who sat on which boards? And that's when the names started appearing again. The same banking families, the same financial networks, not always directly, often through intermediaries, through foundations, through trusts, designed to obscure the connections, but the connections were there. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Publishing is one thing, but education is where the real power lies. Think about how history is taught, not what is taught, how. Through standardized curricula, through approved textbooks, through teacher training programs that enforce methodological uniformity, through accreditation systems that punish deviation. The system seems neutral, objective, scientific even, but neutrality is itself a choice, and that choice serves someone. Here's what I found. The same period that saw the erasure of Tartary from encyclopedias also saw the standardization of history education across Western nations. This wasn't organic, it was engineered. Foundations established by banking and industrial families began funding educational reform movements in the late 1800s and early 1900s. They funded the creation of standardized curricula. They funded teacher training programs. They funded research into scientific education methods. Why would bankers care about how history is taught? The official answer, civic duty, philanthropy, improving society. The evidence suggests otherwise. When you examine what these educational reforms actually accomplished, a pattern emerges. They didn't expand historical knowledge. They narrowed it. They didn't encourage critical thinking about historical narratives. They enforced acceptance of approved narratives. They created a system where questioning the official story became professionally dangerous for teachers and academically punishing for students. Not through overt censorship, through structure, through standards, through the subtle but pervasive pressure to conform. And that's where this becomes impossible to ignore, because the knowledge that disappeared during this period wasn't random, it wasn't scattered, it was specific. Knowledge about alternative power systems, knowledge about decentralized civilizations, knowledge about technologies that didn't require industrial infrastructure, knowledge about ways of organising society that didn't concentrate power in the hands of financial and industrial elites. Gone. All of it. Systematically removed from textbooks, from curricula, from the approved narrative. Why? This is where the conspiracy deepens into something almost unbelievable. Almost. The buildings everyone focuses on, the so-called World's Fair structures, the civic buildings, the cathedrals and infrastructure that appear suddenly in the historical record without adequate documentation of their construction. These weren't just aesthetically advanced, they were technologically advanced. I'm not talking about aesthetics, I'm talking about acoustic design, energy systems, heating and cooling mechanisms that didn't require fossil fuels, water management systems that operated without electric pumps, architectural knowledge that modern engineers struggle to replicate even with contemporary tools. And here's the strangest part, this technology didn't evolve. According to the official narrative, it just appeared, fully formed, implemented across continents within narrow time windows. Then, just as suddenly, it disappeared. Replaced by inferior systems that required centralized power, centralized control, and, most importantly, centralized profit. The pattern is obvious once you look for it. Advanced decentralized technology gets replaced by primitive centralized technology. The primitive technology requires infrastructure. Infrastructure requires capital. Capital requires banks. Banks require control. And control requires ignorance. If people knew what was possible, if they understood the technological capabilities that once existed, they might ask uncomfortable questions. They might wonder why we abandoned superior systems. They might recognize that our progress represents in some ways a regression designed to increase dependence on centralized power structures. So the knowledge had to go. Not just the knowledge of Tartary, the knowledge of what human civilization was capable of achieving outside the industrial financial paradigm. The silence was deafening. Let me walk you through how this actually works, how you erase a civilization from collective memory without anyone noticing. First, you control the sources. You buy libraries, you fund archaeological expeditions, you acquire private collections, you don't destroy them. That's too obvious. You classify them, you restrict access, you place them in institutions where only approved researchers with approved methodologies can study them, and you make sure those researchers understand what conclusions are acceptable. Second, you control the interpretation. You establish the frameworks through which evidence must be understood. You create academic departments that enforce methodological orthodoxy. You ensure that anyone who deviates from approved interpretations faces professional consequences. Not censorship, that would be too crude. Just the quiet denial of tenure, the rejection of grant applications, the exclusion from prestigious journals. Third, you control the narrative. You fund the publishing houses. You endow the university chairs. You establish the foundations that determine which research gets funded and which doesn't. You create the appearance of independent scholarship while ensuring that all roads lead to approved conclusions. Fourth, you wait. Because the most powerful form of control is the one people don't notice. Within a generation, the new narrative becomes the only narrative. The alternative explanations fade from memory. The questions stop being asked. And anyone who does ask gets dismissed as a conspiracy theorist, a crank, someone not serious enough for academic consideration. This isn't speculation, this is documented. You can trace the funding networks, you can map the institutional connections, you can identify the same families, the same organizations, the same methodologies appearing across different institutions, different countries, different disciplines. The deeper I looked, the more the pattern revealed itself. Now we need to talk about the actual structure of this organization, because it's not what you'd expect. It's not a secret society with robes and rituals. It's something more mundane and more powerful. It's a network of networks, banking families at the core, but not acting alone. They operate through foundations, trusts, interlocking corporate boards, cultural institutions. They don't meet in shadowy rooms to plot history's erasure. They don't need to. The structure itself ensures coordination without requiring explicit conspiracy. How? Through aligned incentives. When the same families fund universities, publishing houses, museums and research institutions, when they sit on boards that oversee all these entities, when they establish the grant-making criteria that determine which research gets supported, they don't need to issue directives. The system naturally produces the outcomes they desire. Researchers learn what gets funded, publishers learn what sells, educators learn what's acceptable. And slowly, imperceptibly, the boundaries of acceptable discourse narrow. Not through censorship, but through the subtle architecture of incentive and exclusion. And that's where Tartaria becomes important again. Not because Tartaria itself was some great empire, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. That's almost beside the point. Tartaria matters because its erasure demonstrates the system's capabilities. If they could remove an entire civilization from historical consciousness, what else could they remove? What else have they removed? What else are they removing right now? Here's where I had to stop and ask myself the fundamental question. Why? Why go through all this effort? Why construct this elaborate architecture of historical control? Why erase Tartaria specifically? The answer, I think, lies in what Tartaria represented, or what it might have represented. An alternative model, a different way of organizing civilization, a demonstration that the current system, industrial capitalism, centralized nation-states, hierarchical power structures, fossil fuel dependence, isn't inevitable, isn't the only way. If people knew that advanced civilizations existed outside the Western European model, if they understood that technological sophistication doesn't require centralized industrial infrastructure, if they recognized that the story of progress we've been sold is actually a story of consolidation and control, they might start asking dangerous questions. They might start imagining alternatives. And alternatives are the enemy of monopoly. This is about power in its purest form. Not political power, though that's part of it. Economic power. The power that comes from controlling the systems people depend on for survival. Energy systems, financial systems, information systems. If humanity understood its own history, its real history, not the curated version, we might recognize that we're more capable than we've been led to believe, that the systems presented as necessary are actually optional, that the limitations we accept as natural are actually imposed. Knowledge is power, and the inverse is equally true. Ignorance is control. The erasure of Tartaria wasn't about hiding one empire, it was about hiding possibility itself. Let me give you a specific example of how this works in practice. I reached out to several academic historians who specialize in Central Asian history. I asked simple questions. What happened to Tartary? Why did it disappear from maps and encyclopedias? Was there an actual political entity or just a geographic term? The responses were telling, not because they refused to answer, most were quite willing to engage, but because their answers followed an identical template, almost word for word, across different universities, different countries, different academic backgrounds. Tartary was a vague geographic term used by Western cartographers for regions they didn't understand well. As geographic knowledge improved, the term became obsolete and was replaced by more specific designations. Reasonable enough, except that explanation doesn't account for the specificity in early sources, doesn't account for the detailed descriptions of political structures, trade routes, diplomatic relations, doesn't account for the architectural evidence, doesn't account for the timing of the erasure. When I pressed these academics with follow-up questions pointing out these inconsistencies, the responses changed, not in content, in tone. They became defensive, dismissive. They suggested I was pursuing a conspiracy theory. They recommended I stick to reputable sources, by which they meant sources that supported the approved narrative. Here's what struck me. These were intelligent, educated people. They weren't lying. They genuinely believed what they were telling me. The system had trained them so effectively that they couldn't see the gaps in their own explanations. That's the real genius of this control structure. It doesn't require conspirators. It requires a methodology that becomes invisible to those who practice it. Now we get to what might be the most important part of this investigation. What was actually lost? Not just the history of one empire, not just maps and dates and political boundaries. Knowledge itself, practical knowledge, technological knowledge, wisdom about how to build civilizations that didn't depend on centralized control and extraction. The buildings everyone fixates on, they're symptoms, not the disease. Yes, they suggest architectural and engineering capabilities we struggle to explain. But that's not the threat. The threat is what those buildings represent. The possibility of technological sophistication without industrial capitalism. Free energy systems, or at least energy systems that didn't require centralized fuel distribution. Water management systems that operated through natural principles rather than electric pumps. Architectural acoustics that could amplify sound without electronic equipment. Healing practices that didn't require pharmaceutical companies. Educational methods that developed critical thinking rather than obedience. Social organization that distributed power rather than concentrated it. I can't prove all of this existed. That's the point. The evidence has been systematically removed, dismissed, or reinterpreted. But the gaps themselves tell a story. The silences speak volumes. Why would all of this knowledge disappear during the exact period when industrial capitalism was consolidating? Why would the erasure coincide so perfectly with the rise of the banking and industrial families who profited most from centralized extractive systems? The official explanation: progress, evolution, the natural march of civilization toward better systems. But when you look at what we actually lost, when you consider the environmental devastation, the resource depletion, the dependence on systems we don't control, you have to ask, better for whom? This is where skeptics usually object. How could such a conspiracy be coordinated across so many institutions, so many countries, so many centuries? Fair question, and the answer reveals the sophistication of what we're dealing with. It doesn't require coordination in the traditional sense. It requires aligned incentives and control of key nodes. Think of it like a river system. You don't need to control every drop of water. You just need to control the dams, control the major channels, shape the terrain. The water will flow where the architecture directs it. In this case, the networks control the dams. Individual historians, educators, journalists, they're not conspirators. They're navigating a landscape that's been carefully shaped. They're following incentives. They're pursuing careers within systems that reward certain conclusions and punish others. No conspiracy required, just architecture. And that architecture was built deliberately, over generations, with specific goals: maintain power, prevent alternatives, keep populations dependent on systems they control. The evidence is there. In funding records, in institutional connections, in the precise timing of historical erasures, in the patterns that repeat too consistently to be accidental. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. But here's the thing. Some evidence is too big to hide. Too widespread, too obvious. The buildings still stand, the maps still exist in archives, the encyclopedias still sit in old libraries, the photographs still document structures that shouldn't exist according to the official chronology. They couldn't erase everything, so they reinterpreted it, recontextualized it, explained it in ways that fit the approved narrative, no matter how strained those explanations became. Those buildings, built for the world's fairs, temporary structures. Except many weren't temporary. Many became permanent civic buildings, and the documentation of their construction remains suspiciously vague. Those maps, artistic license, poor geographic knowledge. Except the maps show remarkable consistency across different cartographers, different time periods, different languages. That technology, not as advanced as it looks, we're projecting modern expectations backward. Except modern engineers explicitly say they struggle to replicate some of these techniques. The evidence is there, abundant, obvious. The question isn't whether it exists. The question is whether people are willing to see it, willing to question the explanations they've been given, willing to consider that the gaps might be features, not bugs. That takes courage. Because questioning approved narratives has consequences. even now. Step back from the specifics for a moment. Think about what this means. If our understanding of history has been systematically manipulated, what else don't we know? What else have we been taught that serves power rather than truth? If advanced civilizations were erased from the record, what capabilities have we lost? What wisdom? What alternative paths forward? If the current system is maintained through the active suppression of alternatives, what does that say about its legitimacy, its sustainability? These aren't just historical questions, they're existential ones. Because if humanity is capable of more than we've been led to believe, if we once built civilizations that didn't require the extractive, hierarchical, centralized systems we now accept as inevitable, then everything changes. The climate crisis? Maybe we have alternatives to fossil fuels that were deliberately buried. The financial system? Maybe we don't need banks to organize economic activity. The education system? Maybe there are ways to develop human potential that don't produce scum-obedient workers. The health system? Maybe healing doesn't require pharmaceutical monopolies. But exploring these possibilities requires knowing they exist, requires understanding that what we have isn't all there is, requires remembering that humanity once knew different ways, and that memory has been systematically erased. Why? Because memory is dangerous. Memory sparks imagination. Imagination creates alternatives, and alternatives threaten monopoly. The greatest heist in human history wasn't of gold or territory, it was of possibility itself. So where does this lead? A humanity that doesn't remember, doesn't question, doesn't imagine alternatives, a population dependent on systems they control. Energy systems, financial systems, information systems, educational systems, medical systems. A world where power is so consolidated that it becomes invisible, where the structures that control us feel natural, inevitable, beyond question. This isn't a future they're working toward, it's already here. Most people already can't imagine alternatives to the current system, already believe that industrial capitalism is the only viable economic model, already accept that centralized power is necessary for civilization. The heist is nearly complete, not of wealth, though that's part of it, the heist of imagination itself, but nearly isn't completely. Some remember, some question, some investigate the gaps and silences and realize they're seeing architecture, not accident. And that might be enough, because once you understand the system, once you see how it maintains itself, you can start to resist it. Not through dramatic confrontation, that's too easy to suppress. Through the quiet accumulation of knowledge, through asking questions, through refusing to accept approved narratives just because they're approved, through remembering what they want us to forget. I've given you the evidence, the patterns, the connections, the methods, but I can't give you certainty. This isn't that kind of investigation. What I can give you are questions. Questions that need to be asked, questions that institutions refuse to ask. What technologies have been deliberately suppressed? What alternative models of civilization have been erased? What are we capable of that we've been taught we're not? Why do the same names appear in the same networks across continents and centuries? Why does questioning approved narratives carry professional consequences? What are we not allowed to know? And why? These questions don't have comfortable answers. Maybe they don't have answers at all, but they need to be asked because the silence around them is deafening. And silence, as I've learned, is never neutral. Silence serves someone. The erasure of Tartaria wasn't an endpoint. It was a demonstration, a proof of capability, a message about what's possible when power consolidates sufficiently. They showed us they could rewrite history. The question is, what are they rewriting now? What will we wake up in 50 years having forgotten? What knowledge, what possibilities, what alternatives are being systematically removed from our collective consciousness while we're too distracted to notice? I don't know. I can't know. None of us can know what we don't know, but we can ask. We can investigate. We can notice the gaps. We can question the silences. We can remember that someone decided what we remember. And we can refuse to forget that we've forgotten. The mystery remains, as it must. because some truths are too large, too threatening, too disruptive to be spoken directly. But they can be glimpsed, in the gaps, in the patterns, in the questions nobody wants to answer. And once glimpsed, they can't be unseen. Welcome to the other side of history, the side that asks uncomfortable questions, the side that sees the architecture of control, the side that remembers we've been made to forget. It's not comfortable here, it's not safe here, but it's real here, and that, in the end, might be all that matters. The investigation continues, the questions remain, the silence speaks volumes, and somewhere, in the shadows of our engineered amnesia, the truth still waits, waiting to be remembered.